Today's video was generously sponsored by Seismic Toys. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you're more than likely a massive nerd, i.e. a fan of tokusatsu. And in recent times, there has been a massive effort in preserving the spirit of this cheesy and fun genre of movies and shows. One of those ways being the creation of many different collectibles and toys. Well, I'm happy to announce that today's video is sponsored by one of these groups of people doing exactly that, Seismic Toys, an independent designer toy and figure company that specializes in kaijus and dinosaurs, and are ran by people who, just like you guys, are also big nerds and love the tokusatsu related IPs they make products for. These guys have an amazing catalog of figures in their online store that ranges from products old and new, including many of their own originally made collectible figures. And these guys are legit. They've worked with official licenses like Ultraman and Dawn of the Monsters in the past. As a result, their store has a great lineup of characters and monsters from well-known tokusatsu franchises. Hell, they're even giving lesser-known works some spotlight, like 1977's The Last Dinosaur, of which they're making an actual model for the T-Rex and Polar Borer later this year, along with working on other cool upcoming projects. So don't miss out, I promise it's worth it. They were even nice enough to send me one of their Jiras toy that was inspired by the one that shows up in the Trials of Ultraman comic, and I'm gonna be honest, this thing is freaking adorable. I mean, just look at him, just sitting there, like a good boy. I love him so much. It's got this really cool transparent design to it, and it really makes for a neat display piece. So what are you waiting for? Some kind of coupon code? Okay, fine, if you enter Dino Diego 10, you get 10% off your entire order. And don't worry, no one is excluded here, they ship worldwide. So go to the Seismic Toys site right now to order your next kaiju figure. Links to their site and socials will be down in the description below. Thanks again to Seismic Toys, and with that said, let's get into today's video. The most interesting part when making any dinosaur movie is the process of making the dinosaurs themselves. Over the decades, filmmakers and special effects artists have gotten pretty good at doing the very thing that not even science has been able to do yet, bringing real-life dinosaurs back from extinction. To be fair though, they're only real in the universes of the movies and shows they're made for, but you get what I mean. Dinosaur cinema history is filled to the brim with techniques used to bring them back to life. From stop-motion animation, to puppets, to animatronics, to drawn animation, and in today's case, to the man-in-suit method, also known as suitmation. Over the span of film history, suitmation has been a popular choice to use for movie monsters especially, so it's no surprise that the technique would eventually overlap with dinosaur films. In fact, the earliest example of suitmation in dinosaur movies can be found in the earliest known dino flick, Prehistoric Peeps from 1905. Prehistoric Peeps was a 5-minute slapstick caveman comedy short directed by Llewellyn Fitzhammond that was based on a comic series by the same name. The cartoon, published in the British magazine Punch, was created by illustrator Edward Tennyson Reed, whose dinosaurs were made to look goofy and exaggerated. As a result, the film based on the comics attempted to mirror the same style of comedy and in turn made their dinosaurs goofy as well, being recreated with men inside pantomime costumes. According to many accounts on the story itself, as a scientist drifts off into a deep sleep, he dreams of observing rocks within a cave, only to awaken a prehistoric beast that then chases him outside, where he is able to shoot it down with his revolver. This only attracts more prehistoric animals that continue chasing him until he is finally awoken from his dream by his wife. Due to the rather crude recreations, it's hard to tell exactly what dinosaurs these are supposed to be, though it's likely they're all meant to be fictional prehistoric creatures. There are definitely dinosaur characteristics within them. Hell, at one point even a giant chicken seems to appear in the chase, indicating these guys predicted avian dinosaurs long before it was cool. Regardless of the quality, it's a revolutionary piece of dinosaur media, as it marks the earliest known instance of dinosaurs, or at the very least, analogs of dinosaurs featured in film, and it was done through the use of costumes. However, since this was still the infancy of motion pictures, and in turn the infancy of special effects, people experimented a lot with other techniques, one that were far better in regards to making dinosaurs feel real. Animatronics, drawn animation, and stop-motion animation allowed more freedom to make dinosaurs look and move more realistically, at least more compared to that of costumes and suits. As a result, the suitmation technique would actually be put in the back burner for the next few decades, at least as far as dinosaur films go. As far far as I know, the technique wouldn't make another appearance again in a major dinosaur flick until the 1940s, and only then did it appear a couple of times. First, there was 1940's 1 million BC, a story about a caveman named Tumak who's kicked out of his brutal tribe after a scuffle with the chief, forcing him to venture out into a deadly prehistoric world dominated primarily by real-world animals donned in props and even costumes to be passed off as dinosaurs, a technique given the informal name of slurposaurs. However, there are a few instances in the movie where suits are actually used. In one instance towards the beginning, Tumak and his tribe are hunting for their next meal, eventually taking down a triceratops, which is actually a live pig inside a rubber suit. Later on, after Tumak discovers a different, more civilized tribe, he encounters, battles, and eventually kills a Tyrannosaurus rex, which is a suit being worn by stunt actor Paul Strader. The suit was created by special effects artist Fred Noth, who, like many artists during this point in time, based his suit's design on the dinosaur art by Charles R. Knight. What's seen in the final cut of the movie is actually Noth's prototype of the suit. He had intended to make a final version of it, however, when he finished the prototype and went to go test it out so that he could see what needed improvements for the refined version, one of the movie's directors, Hal Roach, was so impressed with the suit, he ordered Noth to just use the prototype instead of making another version of it. All things considered, it looked like a pretty well-made suit, and a testament to how much dinosaurs had changed in their style since Prehistoric Peeps. But things weren't always consistent, and some dinosaur suits continued to look goofy even if it wasn't intentional. For example, some 8 years later in 1948, Unknown Island would be released, which used rubber suits for their main dinosaur monsters, the Tyrannosaurus rex, which look more comical than threatening. A handful of suits were designed by special effects artist Ellis Berman, who was actually basing them off of Ceratosaurus, using the art of Charles R. Knight as a reference like Noth had done for 1 million BC. Despite this, the actors in the movie actually refer to them as Tyrannosaurs, likely due to the fact that it's just a more recognizable name.
Flesh-eating Tyrannosaurus, giant lizards.
The movie revolves around a group of people venturing to an uncharted island after one of them, a former pilot in the US Navy during World War II, flew over the island during the war and witnessed some kind of long-necked dinosaur. Although the film uses a few different props and models for some of the prehistoric animals in the film, like with the sauropods and Dimetrodon, the stars of the film, the goofy-looking horned tyrannosaurs that attack our characters on numerous occasions, were suits worn by various actors. They made about 3 or 4 latex suits that were fitted with rods and wires within them that the suit actors were able to manipulate. The rod allowed them to move the dinosaur's head about, and the wire allowed them to open and close the dinosaur's mouth. Though, as shown on screen, the mechanism didn't always close the mouth right. But the T-Rexes weren't the only ones being recreated with suits in this film. Though not a dinosaur, the giant ground sloth was also a man in a suit, more specifically Ray Corrigan. And if you think this creature bears more of a resemblance to an ape than a sloth, you'd be correct in that assumption. At the time, Corrigan was a freelance stunt and suit actor that had his own gorilla suits that he would wear when he was commissioned by film studios to appear in their monster B-movies. Though, in the case of Unknown Island, they wanted a giant sloth, not an ape. So as a result, Corrigan made very minor changes to one of his ape suits, adding on claws, extra fur, and other slight modifications to make it look closer to a ground sloth. Apparently, he too used Charles R. Knight's paintings as a reference, more specifically his painting of the Megatherium. What resulted was something that looked more like a crack-headed version of the Megatherium. Though regardless of the quality, the film is a fun watch, especially in the final climax featuring one of the Tyrannosaurs fighting the giant sloth, eventually meeting its end over the edge of a cliff. Suitmation in dinosaur films at this point in time were very much limited, and of what we've seen so far, they weren't anything overly grand. The most you could say is that it has a unique historical significance, since it was the first method of special effects used in a dinosaur film, which in itself is very impressive and interesting. But given its lack of abundance in dinosaur films, it's obvious that other effects were simply more sought out and preferred over it. Whether it's because filmmakers wanted their dinosaurs to look as realistic as possible, or wanted to exploit methods that they thought were easier to execute. In any case, it wouldn't be long before Suitmation would eventually find its footing in dinosaur films and showcase to the world its potential in this medium. Because as the 40s would come to an end and the 50s would progress, there was one movie that would single-handedly change everything for Suitmation. In 1954, a movie studio by the name of Toho Motion Pictures was in the planning stages with the Indonesian government to make a film adaptation of a real-life event during World War II, in which Japan occupied the Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia. The film was to be called In the Shadow of Honor and was to star Japanese actors as their leads. However, the wound was still fresh for many of those that still held anti-Japanese beliefs, which pressured the Indonesian government to cease any kind of collaboration with Japan. As a result, the Japanese actors were denied visas to enter Indonesia, and not long after, the movie would be officially cancelled. Panicked, Toho then assigned the movie's producer, Tomoyuki Tanaka, the stressful task of coming up with a new idea for a film. But all he had to do was look at what was popular around the world. See, there were two major things happening at this point in time. One, the US was well within its atomic age, a time where they had been heavily testing nuclear bombs to continue preparing themselves for the Cold War effort. This was especially relevant for Japan, as almost 10 years earlier they had suffered the two bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The continuing of bomb tests years after the fact only ignited their fear of being struck again. Their fear continued to grow when, around the same point in time, 23 Japanese fishermen were contaminated with radioactive ashes and particles raining down on their vessel around the Bikini Atoll area, which was caused by a nuclear bomb that the US was testing. And two, monster movies were making a comeback, as the 1952 re-release of 1933's King Kong and the release of 1953's Beast from 20,000 Fathoms proved to be financial successes, helping kickstart a trend that would only skyrocket in popularity after they inspired Tanaka's next movie idea, that being Godzilla from 1954, a movie about a massive radioactive prehistoric animal that arises from the depths of the ocean and threatens Japan, whose residents now have to come up with a way to destroy the monster before it destroys them. To make the film's monster possible, Toho enlisted the job to special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya, who initially liked the idea of using stop motion, the technique used for the two American-made monster movies that inspired Godzilla that I mentioned before, but there were two problems with this. At the time, there were no known Japanese filmmakers that were experienced enough with the technique to pull it off. And even if there was, they were on a time crunch. Stop motion is a process that can take up a lot of time, something that Toho couldn't afford. So Tsuburaya was forced to look at other ways to bring their monster to life. Eventually, he settled on the man-in-suit method, where he planned to construct a suit, put a man in it, and place them in miniature sets. Godzilla had a few different looks in his original concepts, but eventually it was decided that he would be given a more dinosaurian look. And more specifically, he would be based on three different kinds of dinosaurs: a Tyrannosaurus Rex, a Stegosaurus, and an Iguanodon. Once they figured out what their titular monster was going to look like, they then moved on to the suit making process, which started out with sketches and clay maquette models. Once they got a general idea of what they wanted Godzilla to look like, they then made an outline of the monster on the wall to then get an idea of the suit size in comparison to the body of the suit actor. In the first film, the suit was worn by actors Haruo Nakajima and Katsumi Tezuka. Nakajima would be better known as he starred in the first 12 Godzilla movies from 1954's Godzilla to 1972's Godzilla vs. Gigan. When they get their basic dimensions down, construction of the suit can finally start. The interior, or skeleton of the suit, would be made with a wire frame that would then be bulked up with a layer of urethane foam to help give it the illusion of weight. Afterwards, an outer skin of latex rubber with the colors and textures would be placed over the foam. This would make up the main body. Other accessories and attachments like the spikes, tail, and head would be added later. The head especially, since typically it would hold all of the main elements connected to the mechanisms used to radio control other parts of the suit. But that was done for later installments of the franchise. For the first couple of movies, the Godzilla suits were controlled manually. For example, there were cables inside the first suit that were attached to Godzilla's mouth. On the other end were bicycle handles that the suit actors were able to pull when they wanted to open Godzilla's mouth for his roaring scenes. Godzilla's critical success would be gradual, as the reviews for it were rather mixed at first. But as years went by, people grew to appreciate it more and more. It seems one of the more praised aspects of the film was its special effects, as Tsuburaya ended up winning a Technical Achievement Award for it by the Japan Movie Association. As for its box office results, the movie was a financial success. This would, unsurprisingly, lead to more movies, as the film would be followed by Godzilla Raids Again in just the following year in 1955. In this movie, a new monster is introduced, a kaiju analog of the dinosaur Ankylosaurus known as Anguirus, which was also done with Suitmation. Godzilla Raids Again set a new precedent for future Godzilla films, in which he would fight, or at the very least, be featured next to other giant kaiju opponents. And over the decades, he's had a very diverse set of adversaries and allies ranging from giant apes, bugs, and of course, dinosaurs, most of which were given life via Suitmation. Despite having prehistoric origins and a dinosaurian look, Godzilla's origins and look have both changed several times over the years, which heavily varied in both quality and continuity. But the franchise has introduced a handful of dinosaurs or dinosaur-like kaijus. For example, there was of course Anguirus, who debuted in Godzilla Raids Again, but has featured in several other Godzilla movies, like Destroy All Monsters, Godzilla vs. Gigan, and Godzilla Final Wars. In 1956, Toho would create a standalone film for a new kaiju monster known as Rodan, who was essentially the kaiju analog of a pterosaur, as evident by the implications of his origins since he's guessed to be related to a pteranodon. But he would be featured in several Godzilla films over the years as well, including Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Invasion of the Astro Monsters, Destroy All Monsters, and so on. Two other dinosaur kaijus also featured in Destroy All Monsters, that being Gorosaurus and Baragon, and they would periodically appear throughout the Godzilla franchise, but their first film appearances actually came from movies that weren't directly a part of the Big G's film series. For Gorosaurus, his debut film was King Kong Escapes, where he served as the supersized dinosaur kaiju equivalent of the iconic T-Rex that Kong usually fights with, and he meets a very similar fate as well. King Kong Escapes was a collaborative effort as it was co-produced by Toho and Rankin Bass in 1967. So when Toho would go on to make Destroy All Monsters in 1968, they would reuse the Gorosaurus suit, a practice that was and still is very common when it comes to tokusatsu. Gorosaurus would also later be used for a Toho-produced TV series called Go Godman in 1972. Baragon, often described as a subterranean dinosaur kaiju, originally started out in Toho's 1965 film Frankenstein vs. Baragon, before being used again in both Ultraman and Godzilla, which I'll talk about more later. In 1972's Godzilla vs. Gigan, the titular new foe is sometimes described as a space dinosaur. In 1975's Terror of Mechagodzilla, Titanosaurus, not to be confused with the real-life sauropod, is described as being an amphibious dinosaur. 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah reinvigorates Godzilla's dinosaurian origins by giving him a proper backstory in the form of Godzillasaurus, a modern fictional dinosaur that escaped extinction and survived all these years on a Pacific island. During World War II, after encountering American and Japanese forces in battle on said island, the dinosaur would be exposed to the radiation from nuclear bomb tests, which would transform him into the deep-sea dwelling monster that we all know and love. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 introduces Baby, a Godzillasaurus hatchling that was laid inside Rodan's nest, whose prehistoric origins are also renewed, as he's compared to that of a pteranodon once again. While it wasn't the first movie to use Suitmation, Godzilla heavily popularized the technique in future Japanese monster movies and TV shows. So much so, the technique was used decades after the '54 film, reaching its peak popularity between the 60s and the 70s. In several cases, the method is still used today, and many of these countless examples feature dinosaurs in their programming as well. Makes sense, not just because many of them are based on Godzilla, who is a dinosaur-like kaiju, but also because many of these programs were aimed at a younger demographic, and if the past had proven anything, it's that kids love their dinosaurs. And the 60s became very popular with tokusatsu projects, especially when Eiji Tsuburaya would branch out and form his own special effects company called Tsuburaya Productions. This studio would go on to make some of the most iconic Japanese shows, like Ultraman, a franchise centered around an extraterrestrial superhero that protects Earth against giant deadly kaijus. The Ultraman franchise is massively abundant, having nearly countless shows and movies made for it. Starting out with the show in 1966, the Ultraman franchise actually featured a colorful variety of dinosaur kaijus over the years, including Juris, which is a reused and modified Godzilla suit used in some of the 60s movies Invasion of the Astro Monsters and Ebora Horror of the Deep. There's also Gamora from the 1966 show, Gomez from 1967's Ultra Q, Arstron, Kingosaurus III, and Stegon from 1971's Return of Ultraman, and my personal favorite, the Dino Tank from 1967's Ultra 7. Ultraman's dinosaurs are definitely some of the weirdest, yet most creative kaiju monsters I've seen throughout this video. I mean, Stegon is literally a living fossil that was in hibernation underground before being awakened by a construction company. In 1998's Ultraman Dyna, a dinosaur-like kaiju named Demogorg is a video game character that's controlled by aliens and is somehow manifested into reality to fight Ultraman. In 2000's Ultraman Neos, there's a kaiju called King Danis, or Dinus, not entirely sure how to pronounce it, that's pretty much a hybrid dinosaur created by combining multiple different dinosaur fossils together and resurrecting it as a live animal to fight Ultraman. I could make a whole separate video on just Ultraman dinosaur kaijus with how many examples there are. There's definitely more examples of them, but these are just some of the highlights of what I ran into during my research. And of course, since Ultraman proved to be very successful, there were many shows that attempted to capitalize off of its popularity, and with them, they featured their own dinosaur kaiju enemies. Some examples include Ambassador Magma from 1966, which featured a dinosaur-like foe in its first episode, and Fireman from 1973, which has a couple of rather unique dinosaur kaijus, like Jurosaurus, who seems to be some kind of mutated long-necked dinosaur, and Stegosaurus, a mutated Stegosaurus-like kaiju. There was also the Triceratops-like Doragon, the fire-breathing Mucunosaurus, and the long-horned Lanosaurus, though I don't actually know if that last one was an actual dinosaur or not. These, of course, are just some of the few in Fireman's roster of kaiju dinosaurs, as like its predecessors, this show too featured many of them. Also, I know this example is meant to make it seem like Fireman was capitalizing off of Ultraman's success, but the funny thing about it is that it was also produced by Tsuburaya Productions. Many tokusatsu shows and movies made dinosaurs their main focus. Some of these included 1960's Marine Kong, a 26-episode TV series produced by Nissan Productions that featured an ocean-dwelling dinosaurian kaiju that actually ends up being a robot. Apparently, with the popularity of kaiju spawned from the many films being made from Toho, Nissan Productions figured serializing the idea could be successful, leading to what's often considered to be the first kaiju-based TV show. There was also 1967's The Monster Prince, a show based around a boy who grows up on a dinosaur-infested island and befriends a brontosaurus named Nessie who protects the boy from an array of prehistoric enemies including Ankylosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, Pteranodons, and so on. 1968 brought us Giant Phantom Monster Agon, a miniseries based on a giant dinosaur monster from the Jurassic period that's been mutated by nuclear weaponry and awoken in modern times to wreak havoc. A very Godzilla-like story, but the monster suit itself was quite different, and was actually reused for the dinosaur that featured in Ambassador Magma. According to many online sources, the show was actually made in 1964, but due to his similar look to Godzilla, Toho basically forbade the TV network that was planning to air Agon, a media company called Fuji TV, from releasing the show. However, when it was revealed that a couple of Toho's associates from previous projects had also been a part of Agon's development, they allowed the show to air, as that was enough to convince them that they weren't trying to copy off of Godzilla, and that the look was just purely coincidental. So with that, the show would air, but by that point it was January of 1968. And Tsuburaya Productions even had their own trilogy of dinosaur shows from the 70s, which consisted of Dinosaur Expedition Born Free, Dinosaur War Eisenborg, and Dinosaur Corps Poseidon. While Dinosaur Expedition Born Free used stop motion to give a more accurate representation to its dinosaurs, Dinosaur War Eisenborg and Dinosaur Corps Poseidon stuck with Japan's more traditionally used suitmation methods. The kaiju craze would eventually expand beyond the bounds of Japan, and soon international movie studios were hopping on the suitmation bandwagon, with many of them being dinosaur-oriented. Kukdong Entertainment Company, a South Korean production studio, would team up with the Japanese media company Toei in 1967 to create Yongari Monster from the Deep, a film made to be a contender to the Godzilla franchise, not just having a similar story, but also using suitmation and miniature sets for the monster sequences. Just a year prior, India also hopped on the giant monster movie train with 1966 Gogola, a giant reptilian monster that emerges from the ocean and attacks Mumbai, forcing authorities to take action, including a scientist who develops a poison to administer to the monster and stop it once and for all. Unfortunately, the film is now lost, as it doesn't seem like it's been archived anywhere. However, stills of the movie still survive, and shows evidence that the production and distribution company Indra Dhanush Films opted to use a crudely made looking suit for the titular monster. In 1961, the UK would release one of their only giant monster films in the form of Gorgo, a film directed by Eugène Lourié, the same man who directed The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms 8 years earlier, the very film that contributed to Godzilla's inception. Beast made Laurié's name very popular, especially around the late 50s when monster movies were becoming a trend. And eventually, he was basically forced into making 1959's The Giant Behemoth as a result of it, and like its predecessor, also used stop-motion animation. During the production of Behemoth, Lourié was approached by Frank and Maurice King, a pair of brothers who ran the film production company King Brothers Productions. They wanted to see if he wanted to direct another monster dinosaur flick. Lourié agreed, but instead of stop-motion, he decided to go with the man-in-suit method, explaining, "You have to use certain means that are most appropriate for the visual effect you are trying to achieve." But the other reason was that he was unhappy with his lack of involvement with the special effects for Behemoth, and figured if he switched things up to Suitmation, he could have more control. This didn't end up happening, because his initial ideas for the suit would be thrown out the window. For example, he wanted the suit to be as lightweight as possible to give more room for acting and so that the monster could move more realistically. However, the King brothers hired technicians that ended up making the suit more elaborate and complicated than Lourié wanted. It would be fitted with all sorts of hydraulic mechanisms that would be connected to the monster's eyes, ears, and tail. This made it hard to perform in the suit, as its heavy size would prove to be strenuous work for the several suit actors for Gorgo, who had to rotate being in the suit since they could only really be in it for a certain amount of time. For Gorgo, Lourié would have a grand total of one suit made for the movie, which is strange considering there are two monsters featured within it, Baby Gorgo and Mama Gorgo. Maybe this was for budgetary purposes, or done so that all resources and energy could be focused on just one suit to ensure it came out perfect, but whatever the case, they managed to complete the movie using just one suit. This was done by scaling down the miniature sets to different sizes based on which monster was going to be represented on screen. And for the final shot of the film featuring both Baby and Mama Gorgo, the two were shot separately, with the baby being shot on a blue background, shrunk down a bit, and composited into the main shot with the mother. Even America would help contribute to the monster suit mania with Rankin Bass's The Last Dinosaur from 1977, which they collaborated with Japan's Tsuburaya Productions to make. After a group of men drilling in the polar caps are reportedly killed by a Tyrannosaurus Rex, the owner of the drilling company, a rich big game hunter, puts together a small team and ventures into the area within the Earth where the previous team died. There, they discover an untouched area within the Earth holding a prehistoric world roamed by ancient creatures. And considering Tsuburaya Productions' history with special effects for monster flicks, it's no surprise that Suitmation was their first choice for the dinosaurs. Included are Pteranodon, Triceratops, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and what is likely an Untotherium that's described as a ceratopsian for some reason. Inside the T-Rex suit was Toru Kawai, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, who's actually been within the suits for many tokusatsu franchises like Gamera and Ultraman. He even played Godzilla in 1975's Terror of Mechagodzilla. Inside the Triceratops suit, which was done using the two men in a horse suit method, was Tatsumi Nikamoto, who was also featured in Terror of Mechagodzilla as Titanosaurus. And while we're on the topic of recurring figures in Suitmation movies, the Tyrannosaurus Rex suit would actually make another appearance in the same year in the aforementioned Dinosaur War Eisenborg TV show, which would be repackaged and re-released in the US as a feature film called Attack of the Super Monsters in 1982. And of course, we can't forget about other popular tokusatsu series like Super Sentai and Kamen Rider, both of which had its fair share of Suitmation too, though in a much different style than the kaiju stuff we've covered so far. And because I don't have the best knowledge with navigating series like Super Sentai and Kamen Rider, I figured I'd enlist my good friend Grarrl Brown to cover it for me. He's primarily a Twitch streamer who is an absolute nerd when it comes to tokusatsu in general, and he helped me out with some of the research for this video. And since Super Sentai is one of the things he's more knowledgeable in, I figured I'd let him take over this segment of the video. Grarrl, take it away.
Dinosaurs have always been a big staple for Super Sentai since some became the first of the franchise as a whole. However, Suitmation-wise, we have to look at 1992's Kyoryu Sentai Zyuranger, or as we know it as the first season of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. It was a landmark for the series going forward. The first to have a mainstay 6th Ranger, the first to have a prehistoric motif, the first to be adapted into Power Rangers. There's more, but you get the point. The two main dinosaur mechs in the series, Tyrannosaurus and Dragon Caesar, were portrayed by your standard kaiju-style suitmation, while the others, Mammoth, Triceratops, Pteranodon, and Sabretooth, also King Brachion, were all portrayed by models or just blown-up version of the toys. If not, they were the actual toys. Suitmation dinosaurs, at least in the 90s and super early 2000s, ended with Time Rangers V-Rex. No, not the Peter Jackson inbred hillbilly Rexes, which portrayed a standard kaiju-style T-Rex with giant shoulder guns that served as the Megazord's arms and weapons. We see a little bit of suitmation in 2003's Abaranger, where the dinosaurs were mainly shown in at the time, more scientifically accurate postures, especially with the T-Rex, and the action scenes with the dinosaurs were done in CGI, since it was the early 2000s and CGI in tokusatsu was becoming more popular, and in this case, freed up the dinosaurs for more dynamic fight scenes and choreography. The suitmation part are the close-up shots of their heads in certain scenes which were portrayed by puppets. Suitmation dinosaurs do see a return with 2011 Super Sentai series, Gokaiger. Here we see Gokai Silver's mech, Golju Rex, a classic kaiju-style T-Rex with a pirate motif, which also references past Sentais to go with Gokaiger's pirate and Sentai anniversary theme. Just like his predecessors, Zyuranger's Tyrannosaurus, Dragon Caesar, and V-Rex, he's portrayed by Suitmation. After Gokaiger, we see Suitmation dinosaurs become the norm with 2013's Kyoryuger, my personal favorite Super Sentai series, where the main dinosaur, Gabutira, is seen as an accurately proportionate T-Rex. 2019's Ryu Soldier, where the main mech and buddy mech of the series, Tieramigo, follows Gabutira in being a Suitmation horizontal posture T-Rex. We have 2020's Kiramager with Smog Joki being the most unique one out of the lot, being a mixture of a gem/crystal, a train, and a kaiju-style T-Rex. Lastly, and as of this video, the most recent addition, with 2021's Zenkaiger being the most recent Sentai to feature a Suitmation dinosaur with the inclusion of Zenkaijuo, a mech that is a mix of Time Rangers V-Rex and Zyuranger's Dragon Caesar. When it comes to dinosaurs, Kamen Rider is pretty late to the party. Debuting back in 2009, the first ever dinosaur-themed Kamen Rider would be in Kamen Rider Double, where the two main writers, Shotaro, Kamen Rider Joker, and Philip, Kamen Rider Cyclone, combined together to make Kamen Rider Fang Joker, with the help from a small robot dinosaur by the name of Fang Memory. In the following year, 2010's Kamen Rider O's. Here, the dinosaur form is known as the Putotira combo, which serves as both Kamen Rider O's final form and the Berserker form. As with this year's gimmick, being 3 core metals, Putotira is no different. It was Pteranodon for the head, which allowed Kamen Rider O's to fly, Triceratops for the torso, which allowed him to impale his opponents with 2 large horns, and lastly, Tyrannosaurus for the legs, which gave him a long-lasting tail. We won't see dinosaur-themed Kamen Riders for quite some time, if we're going by main writers, until 2021's Kamen Rider Revised, an anniversary series that celebrated 50 years of Kamen Rider, and it's also my favorite Kamen Rider series, with the main writer, Revi, and his inner demon partner, Vice, being based on a T-Rex as a base rider form, which is a first for the series. In Revice, there are several forms based around dinosaurs, such as Terraform, Brachioform, literally every form of the 2 main riders, and a special form based off of a Spinosaurus, and the second ever Kamen Rider Nego. As of the recording of this, the most recent dinosaur-themed Kamen Rider would come in 2023's Kamen Rider Gotchard, with the form Super Gotchard, with a, let's just say, a rather unique design for a dinosaur-themed Kamen Rider, and the Kemi X-Rex, a rather stylized interpretation of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, let's just say.
Thanks for your help, Grarrl. I definitely recommend his content if you're interested in stuff like this because he loves talking about it in his streams. I'll leave his platforms down in the description below if you want to check him out. Suffice to say, tokusatsu contributed a lot to Suitmation, and would continue to do so even to this day. But the range of Suitmation only continued to expand over the years in dinosaur films and would take new shapes and sizes. Hell, even during the 50s monster movie craze, another dinosaur film would be released titled The Land Unknown from 1957, which focuses on a small expedition of military personnel to study a warm region near the South Pole. They land their helicopter in what's revealed to be some sort of volcanic crater that houses prehistoric animals in the form of more slurposaurs. However, the main dinosaur antagonist is a more recognizable predator, a Tyrannosaurus rex, which is featured as a man inside a suit. The suit was designed by Fred Noth, the same man who created the T-Rex suit for 1940's 1 million BC. Apparently, it took almost 3 years and $60,000 to produce all the dinosaur props for the film, including the T-Rex suit. And while the suit itself might not look all that impressive given the weird humpback posture it gives off, it did have some more elaborate components to it, mainly in the head. The eyes, mouth, and nostrils were all able to move using hydraulic mechanisms. And almost as if following Suitmation tradition, the suit, or rather the head of the suit, was even repurposed, being featured in 1964's The Munsters as the family's pet dragon, Spot.
Come on down, we got something for you.
The 50s monster movie craze would bleed into the following decades, pumping out a plethora of oversized city-destroying monster movies. And just when the craze looked like it was slowing down, the mid to late 70s only reignited it with all sorts of new monster flicks. These trends, of course, led to many of the titles I previously mentioned. As the 80s rolled around though, dinosaurs were taking a backseat in the film industry, as there were only a handful of films that were made throughout the decade. But one notable film was Baby, Secret of the Lost Legend from 1985, a Disney-produced live-action dinosaur film that follows a married couple into the heart of Central Africa in the search of the Mokele-Mbembe dinosaur. What they find is a small family of brontosaurs that are separated from each other once the African military get involved. What's unique about this film is that the filmmakers decided to take on the fairly difficult challenge of making their dinosaurs move through Suitmation. It made sense with theropods since old science had given them an upright posture, perfect for the method of Suitmation. But something with the body structure of a sauropod, quadrupedal, large body, long neck, and a small head, seems almost impossible to make out of a suit and make it look realistic. But the film's special effects director, Isidoro Raponi, and his team made it possible. Not wanting to use stop motion or full-scale animatronics, they eventually opted to use a combination of cable-controlled mechanisms and Suitmation for the adult brontosaurs, where people would be inside the suit working the legs, while the rest of the dinosaur was cable-controlled by people on the outside. As far as the baby Bronto goes, the only parts that were radio-controlled were his facial features, including mouth, lips, eyes, eyelids, eyebrows, and nostrils. The rest of the baby dinosaur was a suit worn and controlled by an actor. There are times where the awkwardness of the effects show, but overall, I'd say they were pretty impressive for the time. Baby was an 80s outlier as far as dinosaur Suitmation goes, but as the 90s rolled in, things would change. A new era of dinosaur media would arise, giving birth to the decade of Dinomania that I constantly reference on this channel. But in this case, it's for good reason, because the use of Suitmation was prevalent during this decade. The 90s marked a turning point for special effects in film, with CGI being used more frequently and professionally. But it was a commodity that, for one reason or another, not everyone was using. As far as dinosaur films went, many chose to stick with practical effects, and of course, Suitmation was a popular choice. Dinosaurs, Adventures in Dino City, Super Mario Bros., Theodore Rex, Carnosaur, and even the Jurassic Park movies are some of the many examples of films during this point in time that would put men inside dinosaur costumes with various styles and designs. Many of these films took the route of the anthropomorphic, family-friendly look. The anthropomorphism makes sense, considering it gave them the excuse to give their dinosaurs a more upright posture like a human, making it better to function as a suit. That, and to give them recognizable features that would make them more identifiable to the audience. Most of these projects were very experimental and unconventional, and varied in quality and reception. A show like Dinosaurs from 1991 put dinosaurs in a family sitcom, something that hadn't really been done before. The show is based on the everyday lives of the Sinclairs, a family of human-like dinosaurs that were put together primarily with practical effects, a lot of them being suits worn by actors. The idea was originally conceived by Jim Henson during his final years of life, and unfortunately he was never able to see the final product. However, with the help of his family and production company, Jim Henson Productions, the show would go on, and dinosaurs would see the light of day. Inspired by the tech behind the practical work done for the Ninja Turtles movie from 1990, the Jim Henson production team wondered if the same thing could be done for a TV show. What resulted was a wide range of suits and animatronics, each uniquely designed from the ground up for their respective characters. It's very impressive work, especially since each main character is so easily distinctive from one another just from looks and style alone. Each suit had an extensive range of facial movements, allowing them to achieve all sorts of emotional looks that might look uncanny in some places, but great overall. Another project that took on the challenge of featuring multiple dinosaur costumes was Theodore Rex, a very strange comedy film that combines dinosaurs with a buddy cop story that takes place in the future where dinosaurs and humans coexist. The film itself had gone through several years of development hell, resulting in a rather sloppy final product, but one of the better aspects of the film was the animatronic and suit work done for the dinosaurs, of which there were many. Most of them look pretty decent for the time, employing many of the same methods we've seen prior, though some parts of the film's overall troubled production history does bleed through in its special effects, which can be pretty noticeable in some scenes. The Roger Corman-produced Carnosaur was one of the few movies during this dinosaur craze that strayed away from being more family-friendly. Instead, the filmmakers wanted to show the world just how terrifying dinosaurs could be, creating a story about a small Nevada community that's attacked by an unknown wild animal that turns out to be the creation of a mad scientist wanting to resurrect the dinosaurs. They accomplished their dinosaurs by using several types of physical props, like cable rod puppets, miniature sets, and full-scale animatronics. Both of the featured dinosaurs had several different scaled models and props made to be shown in the film, including costumes that were apparently modeled to fit stunt actor Kane Hodder. Which actually makes sense, since John Buechler, the main man behind the special effects for the Carnosaur films, worked with Hodder on Friday the 13th 7 in 1988. Ted Haynes, one of the fabricators that helped with the suits, would state in the History of Carnosaur book, there had been 2 dinosaur creature suits that were never fully completed or used in the film. They were a Tyrannosaurus Rex suit as well as a Deinonychus costume. They had been built to fit stunt performer and actor Kane Hodder. I believe the 2 suits turned out a bit heavy and unwieldy and just couldn't be fit into the film shoot. It's always a shame when so much time, effort, and money is spent on specific costumes or gags and then simply end up not being used. It actually happens more than anyone would think. However, at least in the case for the Tyrannosaurus Rex suit, it was able to see the spotlight in another Roger Corman-produced dinosaur movie, 1994's Dinosaur Island, a risque cave women flick about a tribe that's terrorized by a Tyrannosaurus Rex. The suit appears in a few forced perspective shots that showcases the tyrant lizard terrorizing the island inhabitants. By the time Carnosaur 2 was in production, Haynes was brought back and was more involved, with his biggest job being the new raptor suit. My biggest job on the show was creating a raptor suit to fit on a performer. We had a limited mechanized head for that creature suit. I foam fabricated the bodysuit that connected up with the cast and mechanized head and neck. The same suits would be reused for Carnosaur's third and final movie, Carnosaur 3: Primal Species. And while the suits aren't perfect by any means, they definitely look good for something a part of a low-budget project. Jurassic Park's dinosaurs too were accomplished with a variety of effects, courtesy of special effects artist Stan Winston and his team. But for the raptors specifically, suits were constructed for some sequences, like for example the kitchen scene where the raptors are stalking Tim and Lex. The raptor suits were worn by actors John Rosengrant and Mark Crash McCreary and were made to be as realistic as possible. The rods and mechanical systems that controlled the head motion and facial features were designed to make the movements of the dinosaurs as natural as possible. They were also designed to make the dinosaurs more up-to-date with the latest science of the time, since the suits were also designed to make the raptors achieve movements that were similar to that of birds. For example, the neck was given a lot of flexibility that gave the raptors a range of motion, like head bobs as it walks and craning up its head to let out certain calls. Rosengrant would don the raptor suit in all 3 original Jurassic Park movies. The leg rig used in the first movie would later be remade almost identically for its sequel, The Lost World: Jurassic Park, in 1997. Jurassic Park 3 also featured raptor suits with yet another leg rig similar to that of the first movie. But even more impressively, the film also featured a full-scaled pteranodon costume that, like the raptors, were designed to have the flexibility to be moved as naturally and realistically as possible. And while it's not the first pterosaur to be made as a suit, its overall design and style is unique in comparison to some of the other examples we've seen in this video. A pterosaur has a body structure that, at first, seems almost impossible to turn into a suit without taking major creative liberties that might make it look very exaggerated. So it's really cool to see what a more updated version of it looks like. Jurassic Park popularized another major special effects technique that was gaining a lot of traction throughout the 90s and especially in the 2000s. That being computer-generated imagery. CGI would eventually take the place of the more physical special effects work, including suitmation. As a result, the method would once again take a backseat in many areas of the film industry. Of course, it would still be used to some extent in tokusatsu, considering how respected and loved it is. But as Grarrl mentioned earlier, the use of CGI would even become popular amongst tokusatsu. That's not to say practical effects aren't still used in dinosaur films, but as far as suitmation went, it's not as commonly used. But it's not totally abandoned either, as it has found a place in some films, primarily the lower budget ones, like Asylum's 100 million BC from 2008. Despite the movie being largely made up of bad CGI, there was a raptor suit made for one of the dinosaur attack sequences, which takes place shortly after a group of soldiers go through a portal on a rescue mission to find another group from a previously failed trip to the past. The suit was designed by the Robert Miller monster making studio, and features a very strange looking raptor. One with bulgy eyes and leg proportions that are completely out of place. This is mainly due to how they decided to approach designing the costume. They went for the horizontal body look for the raptor, but instead of having the suit actors bend over to account for the animal's body structure, it was actually made for the suit actors to stand up straight in, as a mechanical hand device would run through the neck that allowed the actors to control the dinosaur's head. It's not a particularly good suit, but for the Asylum, it's an absolute masterpiece. 2014's Extinction Jurassic Predators, alternatively known as The Expedition, follows a crew of explorers venturing to the Amazon rainforest only to encounter a hungry dinosaur. It's shot as a found footage movie, so there are many blink and you'll miss it moments, but it does use a costume for its Tyrannosaur monster, which looks nice, but maybe that's just because I'm looking at it next to the 100 million BC raptor suit. And of course, we can't forget the iconic dinosaur costume from 2017's Velocipaster, an absurdist low-budget comedy film about a priest that comes across an ancient relic that turns him into a velociraptor. Now he fights crime, like ninjas and drug dealers. The suit is very crudely made, and despite being called Velocipaster, it looks more like a T-Rex that's fallen on some hard times. But that was most likely done on purpose to add on to the movie's self-aware humor. That, or the people who made it really didn't know what they were doing. Regardless of the quality, it just goes to show the range of dinosaur suitmation. Whether it's well-made monster movies or low-budget creature features, whether it's made to be goofy or meant to be taken seriously, whether it's just for one sequence or the main star of the show, it's got its place in history. However, it hasn't been without its struggles. Now, the idea of being put in a dinosaur costume and wreaking havoc on a miniature set might sound like a lot of fun, but in all actuality, there was a lot of difficulties that suit actors had to endure when it came to wearing and moving around in these costumes. And I'd be remiss if I didn't take some time to at least mention a few notable examples. Dinosaur suits came in all shapes, sizes, weight, and quality, but some were more difficult to work than others. In many cases, the suits had little to no ventilation, meaning you'd be extremely hot wearing them for long periods of time. In the case of Unknown Island, there's a piece of trivia that's often told where during the Tyrannosaur shootout sequence, there's a moment shown where one of the dinosaurs falls over, presumably from being hit. However, that was not at all planned. They had shot this scene on a very hot day in a desert, which in turn made the inside of the rubber suit very hot. As a result, the actor inside the suit ended up succumbing to heat exhaustion and passed out, causing him to fall over, which they just kept in the movie. No film franchise tested an actor's patience within a suit more than Godzilla. Donning the suit of the Big G was no easy task. From the very start, there were problems that made it difficult for the actors to work inside the costumes. The heat, the sweat buildup, the uncomfortable material rubbing against their skin, the lack of vision, the awkward movements that would make them trip, and so on and so forth. And of course, there was the work that needed to be done for the films. In this franchise alone, there were a lot of sequences that involved being submerged in water, being around pyrotechnics, being buried, and so on. All while trying to move around in a rubber suit with very little vision and plenty of blind spots. Accidents were bound to happen, and some were even kept in the film. I won't be able to list every single one of them for the sake of brevity, but here are some notable examples. As I mentioned earlier, in the first Godzilla there were two suit actors, Katsumi Tezuka and Haruo Nakajima. Apparently during filming one day, as Tezuka rose up from the water, a live cable in the water electrocuted the entire pool, including Tezuka, which knocked him out. Luckily, he was fished out of the water and was able to make it out of the ordeal okay. During a different filming session with Nakajima in the suit, he had suddenly fallen over, catching everyone by surprise. When he was taken out of the suit, it was revealed that Nakajima had passed out, likely from heat exhaustion. In Godzilla vs. Mothra from 1964, Nakajima was supposed to slip from the moat and land on a model of Nagoya Castle, but on one of the takes, he landed on the castle wrong and ended up breaking a section of Godzilla's snout on it. In the same movie, there was a scene where explosives were going off and catches Godzilla's face on fire, which wasn't supposed to happen but was kept in anyway. On a little side note, since we're on the topic of Nakajima, who by the way was a trooper about working in the Godzilla suit, he was apparently more than willing to endure all of the struggles that came with suit acting. As a result, he was no stranger to accidents. In 1956's Rodan, the cable that was holding the actor and the suit in one sequence ended up snapping, causing him to fall from 25 feet in the air into water. That, coupled with the fact that the suits themselves aren't the easiest to move on land, let alone water, the accident could have been fatal. Luckily, Nakajima made it out and persevered through the Godzilla franchise. The suit actor for Godzilla in Return of Godzilla from 1984, Ken Satsuma, cut his leg pretty badly from an exposed wire within the suit. Satsuma would play the role of Godzilla throughout the entirety of the Heisei era. In Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah from 1991, during the Rampage in Sapporo scene, there was a point where Godzilla fell through the underground structure, causing him to fall over, which as far as I've seen was planned. What wasn't planned was a concussion that Satsuma would receive when accidentally hitting his head on the side of the opening during the sequence. Vision and foot placement were definitely some of the more common difficulties when it came to suit acting. It's hard to put on several pounds of rubber, latex, and mechanisms and be expected to move around naturally with limited vision. Suit actor Bill Barretta had experienced this a lot when it came to working on 1991's Dinosaurs, where he admits that the only time he would ever really be able to see in the show was when Earl's mouth was open.
If you watch some of the episodes and Earl is crossing the room, he tends to kind of sigh a lot. And that was just so I could see for the next 10 feet, where I was going to go.
Aside from this, he would also just have to memorize where things were so that he didn't run into them. While we're on the topic of dinosaurs, the suits also posed another issue. That being the fact that they were very expensive to make, to upkeep, to work, and so on and so forth. That, coupled with the other several practical effects, props, and set pieces, the show was no doubt very costly to keep up with. And while it wasn't the only reason for its abrupt end, as that mainly came from the ratings dip it got from switched time slots, it likely contributed to it. At one point, Stuart Pankin, the voice actor for Earl Sinclair, stated, "I heard it was the most expensive half-hour TV show, at least at that point, because of the maintenance of the animatronics. In the end, it wasn't worth it for them." Going back to the topic of weighty suits, they have always been a hurdle for these kinds of productions to overcome. As mentioned earlier, the plans for Gorgo's suit was to keep it as lightweight as possible, but because all sorts of mechanisms were added onto it, it made it very difficult for the actors to work in. According to Eugène Lourié, the actors also had to be fitted with metal helmet-like supports before putting on the rest of the costume, which made it very hard to maneuver in. Because of the strenuous work, there had to be multiple suit actors there to switch out, as each could only really be in the suit for a certain amount of time. This experience also brought out another problem with Suitmation that Lourié would later express. During one interview, he stated that he felt stop-motion animation gave the monsters more life than Suitmation. To some extent, it is true that stop-motion animation can allow for more freedom of movement and expression for a dinosaur, as several movies have proven in the past. But that's not to say Suitmation can achieve the same thing when enough time and effort is spent on it. In the case of Gorgo, there seemed to have been a lot of interference with Laurié's plans for the suit, causing a lot of differences in ideas and creative liberties, ultimately resulting in the final product we have now. To me though, I don't think it looks bad at all. But what does look bad are what the suits end up looking like when they reach the end of their lives. Despite being made with physical props, the material these suits are made from have a shelf life, and aren't always able to be salvaged. Of course, this just means that the studios using these suits have to use them for all that they're worth before they reach that threshold, especially since, in a lot of cases, they're working under a tight budget as well. I mentioned it earlier in the video, but it's not uncommon for suits to be reused multiple times for different projects. One popular example of this is Baragon's suit, which is probably one of, if not the most reused suit in any kaiju film. Originally starting off in Toho's Frankenstein vs. Baragon in 1965, the studio allowed Tsuburaya Productions to have the suit for their Ultraman projects. Baragon's suit would be modified and reused for several different kaijus like Pagos in 1966's Ultra Q, and Naranga, Gabora, and Magular in 1966's Ultraman. The suit was then brought back to Toho to use for their upcoming 1968 Godzilla film, Destroy All Monsters. Baragon wouldn't be seen again in the Godzilla franchise until 2001's GMK, and by that point they had just made a whole new suit for the subterranean dinosaur. Apparently, the original Baragon suit was so worn down from being used so many times that it was basically falling apart and had to be discarded altogether. He was planned to have a bigger role in Destroy All Monsters, but due to the suit's condition, they decided to just replace his head, place him in the background of all the other monster stars, and call it a day. Baragon was originally going to be the monster to attack Paris, but since Gorosaurus' suit was a lot better, they decided to use him instead. However, Gorosaurus also hasn't fared well over the years, as by the time he was featured in Go Godman, it's hard to ignore that his suit was also heavily deteriorating. Unfortunately, this is the case for most of these movies and shows that use dinosaur suits. The props themselves usually don't withstand the test of time. In some cases, the suits are either put on display at exhibits, sold through auctions, or kept inside a warehouse never to be seen again. Wherever the suits may end up, one thing is certain: they are forever immortalized in the shows and movies that featured them. As far as what the future holds for the technique in dinosaur films, I'm not entirely sure what to expect. With CGI being the main choice nowadays, it's likely we won't see that much from Dinosaur Suitmation from this point on. However, the method is still being kept alive in tokusatsu projects like Ultraman, which continue to feature dinosaur-like kaijus in their works. That being said, even big names like Godzilla have gone full CG in a couple of their films in recent times. But that's not to say that's a bad thing. I've always been of the belief that CGI isn't a bad tool, but it can be when you factor in a lack of time, effort, and/or funds. But certain movies have proven that it can definitely work under the right conditions. But who knows, maybe in the future we'll see more suitmation from these works. It's not like the method has been completely abandoned, and many still seem to appreciate the work that goes into making it. Regardless of what the future holds for suitmation, at least in one way, the method has proven to withstand the test of time. If not in quality, then in entertainment.